السيدات والسادة، رحبوا معنا مجدداً بالسيد جون ديفتيريوس من قناة CNN وأعضاء جلسته النقاشية.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back from CNN, John Defterios and his panel.
Good morning. Good morning. It's nice to be back on stage here.
صباح الخير، ويسرنا أن نعود إلى المنصة هنا، وبما أننا نحن كنا نتحدث عن
January. A lot has happened since January and the potential for Bahrain in the space of oil and gas. We often
ونحن عادة نقوم بتحديد
for a country, this could be it. You're going to have a very interesting debate. We've put together a terrific cadre of specialists in the oil and gas space, and we have the blessing of the oil minister himself. Just a couple of numbers to put this into context. What is the potential for Bahrain in the near future? At least 81 billion barrels of unconventional reserves for a country of this size is pretty extraordinary. In context of reserves, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia next door sits on top of 265 billion barrels. We'll have a debate of whether these proven reserves and recoverable reserves really make a difference in today's unconventional world. 13.7 trillion cubic feet in the onshore gas field. This is a region that doesn't sit on a lot of gas that's been tapped yet, and we know the role of natural gas when it comes to economic growth. It's actually essential because in the last 10 years, last 2 decades, we have countries burning oil to drive their economies, and of course in the climate change discussions we're having today, that's not sustainable, and it's also very costly as well. Let's introduce each one of our panelists. We're going to have a 40-minute debate, and I'm going to reserve at least the last 10 minutes to have some questions from the floor, because many are probably wondering, is this really a game changer? Is it accessible? Can it be financed? Is the infrastructure in place? What's the potential, and what does it mean for Bahrain going forward in the bigger drive of diversification and investment in the kingdom? First and foremost, let's welcome His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed Khalifa Al Khalifa, the Minister of Oil here in Bahrain. You get what we call the prime seat to my right, which is a pleasure. Christophe Amédée, Director of Unconventionals for Total, the French energy giant. Trisha Curtis, President and co-founder of a company called PetroNerds in the United States, looks at a specialty in shale and unconventional discoveries in the States. James Chinosky, Managing Director, Co-Head of Oil and Gas for JP Morgan Chase. And one who's been very active here in the early stages of this development for Bahrain is Jim Taylor, Vice President, Consulting and Project Management for the services giant Halliburton. So we've had a breakfast that was hosted by the Omanis, so I know we're going to have more people filtering in, but I'm glad to see this is a very good crowd for the second day of the Gateway Conference. I think it's representative of the fact there's great interest, Your Excellency, in this potential for Bahrain. I wanted to see if we could, first and foremost, put it into perspective. Is it the game changer, potentially, for Bahrain in terms of getting beyond 80,000 barrels a day of production, which includes a shared field with Saudi Arabia? And how do you manage expectations going forward as well? This is part of the game, right? You have to manage expectations, manage the investment flow, and manage the future in terms of development economic revenues as well.
Thanks, John. I think a correction, we produce close to 220,000 barrels of oil condensate and liquid petroleum gas, and another 250,000 of barrels gas oil equivalent from the Bahrain field. So, and predominantly, a large part of it comes from the shared field that Aramco operates. We also produce 43,000 barrels from the Bahrain field. That is now being looked at for enhanced oil recovery. It still has 85% of the original oil remaining, but it has a complex geology, and we've been working with service companies, the likes of Halliburton and Schlumberger and Baker Hughes, to really apply technology to it. It's quite a unique field. Now the tight oil is basically the source rock that gave you the giant fields of Arabia. So Bahrain geographically is part of what's called the Ghawar uplift. And these are the source rocks that generated the Ghawar field, the Bahrain field, the Abqaiq field, the largest oil fields of this particular region. And per square kilometer, it is known as the most prolific oil generating system in the world. The era of easy oil is over. Nobody's discovering any giant fields anymore. So the next trend is to go to these more unconventional resources. Now we've done a lot of work for the Khalij al-Bahrain basin, which we declared not too long ago, but we've known about it for a number of years. We flowed oil to the surface last year, which makes it a discovery. What we do know is that the oil is actually there. I think there's zero risk in knowing that the oil is there. I think the next challenge is to figure out what the true cost of the production would be. We know that the geology is actually favorable. So when you frack, and these are tight resources, the quality of the rock and the lithology, what it's made of, is very important. And we are in the best place you could be. So this is 90+% carbonate, which means that fracking is going to be extremely good. It also has what's called high porosity permeability streaks. And in the US, this happens in the best of sweet spots. Those give you high flow rates and lower cost of production. So the Permian now is the most successful basin, and you've got costs that have come down below the $30, and I'm sure we'll hear this from the panels later. So what we will do now is we're drilling 2 wells with the help of Halliburton this time, and keep them on an extended flow test. And hopefully with the flow rate we get, we will determine a little bit more what the performance of the rock is. Now the idea is to try and attract investment. So JP Morgan and with their expertise could potentially help us define what the fiscal terms need to be to attract that kind of investment. So with that information, we'll be better positioned to really know what the rock does. We're also working on a tight gas resource that's below the Bahrain field. And we've known about this for a bit longer and worked for more than a year with service companies, and on your final stage negotiations for a development program that has up to 20 trillion cubic feet of gas, which we will start developing this year. That requires some fracking, so it's in between a conventional and unconventional, but very exciting for the upstream side. And we still are working on an exploration program for conventional. We've been working with the likes of Eni, and there are prospects in offshore Bahrain. So the petroleum system here is quite prolific. And the oil is there, there's no doubt. But for the tight oil, of course, you need technology. And we're very excited about the future, inshallah.
Okay, very good. Before we move on, I'm going to call in Jim from Halliburton first. I wanted to alert you to the app that's online if you want to get updated program and guests on the panel, so they can bring it up on the screen up there. And then because of this debate, and it generated a lot of media coverage initially when you announced it and you were in Dubai, when I was traveling to different parts of the region because of the news cycle we've been faced with, there's some social media hashtags as well. So if you want to jump into the debate or ask questions on the social media side because of the interest, I wanted to see for this audience, if we can put this in context, Jim, about other discoveries, because the word unconventional in the Middle East is pretty unusual because access to conventional oil has been pretty simple. So when it comes to tight oil, for example, or unconventional oil, how does this rank in terms of size for oil and gas for perspective? And is it easy to get to in the shallow waters, for example, offshore in Bahrain?
Yeah, thank you for that question, John. I think the first comment that I'll make is, I think what happened over the last 10 years in the United States was totally unforeseen. It was the convergence of multiple technologies that were able to tap into a resource that was not thought to be producible. So in the context of what is being discovered here, very, very interesting. It's interesting from the point of view that it does display some of those successful characteristics that we've seen in other fields around the world. but yet there are still other characteristics that have not been determined. So we're in early phases of exploration and appraisal, and as His Excellency had communicated, there's still a lot of work yet to be done, but there's optimism and room for optimism. I will say, though, that I always caution audience when I talk about unconventionals is to not oversimplify what happened in the United States. Unconventionals are different. They do require different forms of analysis that go into where to drill the well, how to drill the well, how to design the frac, and where to frac. Those matter a lot more than conventional wells. The orientation and the direction of where the stresses are in the reservoir, how it actually is put in position to be most successful in the stimulation, are things that have not been determined. So I think those are important things to consider. Early days, but very exciting. The potential could be large, very large.
Okay, a quick follow-up and be candid about the answer. When you first heard about this in Bahrain and then you did your exploration wells, you said, wow, or potentially wow? What did you think?
Yeah, no, that's a great
You
question.
didn't have this in the context for Bahrain, right?
Honestly speaking, I think anybody that had witnessed what happened in the United States says offshore unconventionals, wow. But what I think is most exciting about it is that's a natural evolution. You think about the technologies and the technology advancement that went into bringing those reserves possible, the infrastructure that was necessary, the ability to handle water and sand, put stresses on infrastructure on shore, and then trying to apply that to near shore. There's a lot of challenges there associated with that, which will speak to the economics. But I think the fact that the resource potential is there, those successful characteristics of a formation that may look like some of those successful West Texas formations, it's quite exciting. It has to be determined, and it's well worth working on.
Okay, I'm going to bring Christoph in after I bring in Tricia. Compare it to what we've seen, because you had a chance to go to the fields the other day on the visit with His Excellency. The unconventional influence in the United States, technology and the advancements in technology, and what capabilities that gives to Bahrain today. I mean, they get a chance to ride the wave of the technology in the States and apply it to Bahrain or not. Trish?
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunity is huge, right? As my colleague mentioned, I think the advancements in the U.S. have been pretty rapid. What we've seen in the past 10 years has been magnificent. But really, most critically, is how quickly it's changed. It continues to change, and the evolution of those completion designs, and the more you understand about the rock quality and the ability to extract only increases. So seeing what I saw in Bahrain and looking at the potential, it's extremely perspective, and it's very exciting to see what could happen when you apply the latest technologies that's happening in the U.S. with large volumes of frac sand and testing fluid volumes and size volumes and quantities. Bahrain has the chance to catch on this wave instead of taking 10 years to learn about it. And so there's a lot of knowledge and technology that can be applied immediately that doesn't have to be, you don't have to wait for that to happen.
Okay. What's your early analysis, Christoph? Because you spend your life in unconventionals. So this idea of getting unconventionals offshore, they have the onshore gas field as well. You use the analogy of a storefront. You used to be able to go, put your straw on the ground and dig up and get the oil pretty easily in the Middle East. This presents a challenge, but the technology also presents the opportunity. How do you see that equation?
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah. Opportunities and challenges always linked together. Any challenge, if you are able to face it, can become an opportunity for growth and for development. Coming back to the question of the volumes, yes, everyone can be impressed of the volume announced associated with each discovery. It's not something surprising when you talk about unconventional. Why? Because even if there is no one single definition of unconventional, I think that the oil industry agrees to regroup the 5 domains of shale gas, shale oil, tight gas, tight oil, and coal bed methane within this family of unconventional. And when you think of that, you think of large basin structures and no longer small traps below a seal. So the volumes are associated with unconventionals are always huge. The volumes of resources in place. The challenge, as it was mentioned, is how we can transform these resources into production into produced reserves. And that is the challenge. One of the challenges is, you mentioned it, is being offshore. So far, most of the development of unconventionals in the States, for example, but also in other places such as Argentina, have been developed onshore. Offshore is bringing additional challenge, but it can bring also some advantages, as some costs associated with logistics can be improved compared to onshore costs.
Okay, and here's the multi-billion-dollar question I've been waiting to present, is that who's going to finance this? In this environment, and everybody gets very excited, I'm sure the minister as well, but he's much more sober than most in the region. You get $75, $77 a barrel overnight because of the tensions with Iran. That's not an instant kickoff and say, I finance it easily. How do you finance something that's more expensive than the cost per barrel that you would find next door in a conventional field in Saudi Arabia?
A few comments. One, the single biggest challenge for companies like Total and the big oil companies that are not here in the Middle East are access to resources and replenishing their reserves. So the volumes that we're speaking about here are quite large. Secondly, in the region, it's been very difficult for foreign companies to have access to the resources. A few places, Abu Dhabi, Iraq, people have had. So the fact that the kingdom's willing to open it up to bring in foreign investors would be very important. The shale resources...
Stop for just a second, because this is a very important point, into this idea of being business friendly, and please hold your microphone for this one. Does it make a difference when somebody says, I'm going to allow you into my field? ADNOC did so, and Total did well in Abu Dhabi. But why is that a difference in terms of the ability to raise money faster, in your view?
Because for the oil companies to have access to a prospective basin and the resources like this, it's an opportunity that's not very often available for them in the world of where cheap oil isn't available anymore. The other point, which is the downturn proved to the big oil companies that short cycle and low cost production is very important. And the shale has achieved that in the US. And thirdly, the big super majors and the big oil companies weren't the ones that developed the shale industry in the US, but they learned, and now they're taking that and exporting it internationally. So the Totals, the Exxons have been the ones that have invested a lot in Argentina. So they're learning and taking it from the US so they could bring it here to Bahrain also to work with the kingdom.
Okay, you guys are bringing up some very interesting points. What's the break-even point that people would feel comfortable in financing these projects in Bahrain? And we have average production cost of $6, $8 a barrel here in this region, as you know. In an unconventional setting, what do you feel comfortable with?
Most of the major oil companies are telling their public investors that they're setting their budgets to work at an oil price of between $40 and $50, so that it's a business that's resilient. So if the cost, and it's still early days as all the panelists have said, if it can be developed that's acceptable within those constraints, there should be significant interest then.
Okay, James. Trish, it's a good point here. You come in with the premise that it's not the large players like Total who's had phenomenal success in the Middle East. Should Bahrain be considering small, nimble, technology-driven, quick producers to come into the region? Or is the comfort level better with the, and this is a pretty pointed question right in front of the minister, but let's have the debate. That's what this is all about. What are your thoughts?
I mean, there's probably a way to do both. But I would argue in favor of a smaller, nimbler company, because I think if you think about what's developed, what created the success in the US and how it worked and how those costs were driven down, and we need to remember that shale was expensive, right? I mean, everybody knew this, OPEC knew it, it was expensive. So when prices dropped, people were freaking out. But what they did was just take the brute force approach and pump a ton of sand and a ton of fluid and get their production rates up and sort of live through this. And they got cash flow from it and sort of bled through. But we have a unique capital environment and liquidity in the US to where there was a lot of money flowing into it. And so these smaller companies were able to get money and to be more nimble and flexible. Some of them definitely went out of business. But you create these teams that are extremely resilient and successful. And I think it's that it doesn't necessarily matter who the company is. It's about the human capital that you bring in, the technological technological advantages, the ones that have really been working on this. And you know, the Permian Basin is multi-layers of carbonates and sandstones and shales. This is carbonate that we're talking about. So you want to take that technological know-how, probably from the individuals, and you want to bring them over here, and you want to see what they can do.
Okay. How much on this technology curve, I was making the analogy, Minister, with the iPhone and the revolution in the last 10 years and how things keep on changing. We can even broadcast from an iPhone or a smartphone if we wanted to. What were you hearing from this audience today on the panel, but of the experts you've reached out to here, how the technology revolution is going to benefit Bahrain in this cycle, do you think? You're hitting it at the right time, I would imagine, because costs have been driven down for production. What are you picking up?
Absolutely. I think just a correction, it's not really offshore. This is 10 meters average depth. So people call this bathtub environment. So there's no big waves. This is not the north.
It's not the Gulf of Mexico.
Not the Gulf of Mexico. So it's, yeah, there are ways, and reclamation is one of them. Absolutely, service costs have come down extremely low levels. The jack-up rigs are cheap. I think service companies have optimized their costs. I hope they don't get too excited with the ramp-up of oil prices, but I think they've been very cost competitive lately. Not just in upstream, we've seen this in all our projects. I think we've been extremely lucky with all our projects in Bahrain. We've hit the markets in the right time. We've seen a 20, 30, sometimes even a 40% reduction in capital expenditure and service costs. But in terms of technology, ultimately these are wells that you have to drill. And you have to continuously drill them. This is a new basin. Saudi Arabia has been working on something that's called the Jafurah Basin. Similar rock, they've already drilled more than 100 wells. So the technical papers are out there. We know what this rock is about. It's called the Hanifa and the Twig Mountain. And the geologists call it between a conventional and unconventional. And hopefully here in Bahrain, I think with 2,000 square kilometers of sweet spot, there's room for small players and for big oil as well. So I think there's enough to try everything. We're also looking, we've set up a fund, and we've announced it yesterday together with a pension fund here in Bahrain and SECO. Halliburton has had experience in the US where they've collaborated with funds, so passive investors that trust Halliburton and Schlumberger to do the right thing and produce oil. But that's another avenue for us to develop. And with a basin that large, we believe it's going to be quite consistent. Again, geologists call this pancake geology. We've been using a technical consultant called Newtech. Steve Roth is somewhere in the audience. He was the first consultant that worked with us to identify this. So yeah, we've been working on this for like 8 years now.
Let me follow up quickly. This is pretty innovative to put together a fund of this nature to invite investors to come in to your markets. You're co-investing in this fund as well, right, to accelerate the exploration?
Well, I think with Vision 2030 and the private sector being the true engine of growth, we've, with this fund, we're actually giving them access to an asset class in the region never made available. And it's not just the upstream, it's the midstream and the downstream. And we've given this a lot of thought, so it's going to be very much investor friendly. These projects have been de-risked, they're under construction. We're putting in place an exit mechanism for the investors. We're just trying to diversify and really get the private sector to get a flavor of these assets which give you double-digit returns. And the numbers we've used have always been debt numbers, very conservative, and yet the returns are extremely high.
Okay. I'm going to be a little bit more provocative here for the next 5 minutes before I go to the floor with questions. In my mind, it seems like Iraq has great potential in natural gas and oil. That's because of the political uncertainty, it hasn't been able to develop. We know the situation with Iran. It wanted to raise over $200 billion by 2025. It looks like politics will stand in the way. Is there a danger, and I'd love to open this up to the panel, to challenge the premises that we have this morning, that we have stranded assets because of the great energy transition that's taking place over the next 20 or 30 years. So Bahrain will see this come to market because it's open, willing to take investment. But do you see the Middle East sitting on oil reserves or gas reserves as we go to the transition to renewables or not? And does this factor into your finance, James, or not?
I think there is definitely the potential that we could have stranded resources around the world as companies make investment decisions about what works and what doesn't work from an economic perspective. But a lot of it's also driven by geopolitical and economic aspects for people to have access to them. The issue will be relative investments and how those sequence each other. So it's more of who's available, who offers an opportunity for companies to invest in first. Stable economic environment, stable legal environment, clear fiscal regimes. Those will attract the capital first.
Good. What's the initial belief on Bahrain? I know you're standing in front of the minister, but when this came to market, do people say, oh, wow, good opportunities, I know the conditions are right? Is this the language? Or I don't need to bother, I've got Saudi Aramco coming to the market, and I'm happy with that and the ADNOC opportunity?
It's definitely the former from what we've heard from the sector. There's a lot of interest about this opportunity, and I think it's important to put it in a couple of perspectives. One is, Jim has said, and His Excellency has said, it's still early, but there's an oil perspective, there's a gas perspective, and there will also be related investments in downstream refining, maybe chemicals. So it's quite a large industrial opportunity, and as I said at the beginning, it's very hard for most of the big oil companies to have access to something of this scale in today's world.
Good. Speaking of scale, Christophe, in different parts of the world where Total has been involved, say Argentina, how does this look in terms of access to the fields themselves and getting this to market, the potential for it, vis-a-vis everything else that Total has in its portfolio today?
As you mentioned, we have activities associated with unconventionals in the States. We are operator there in Barnett. We are developing right now unconventional resources in Argentina. We developed in the last 5 years tight reservoirs, and we are developing now shale reservoirs in Argentina with very successful activities there. We have been we have created an OPCO, operating company, with PetroChina in China on the South Siligue project, and we have more than 600 wells producing there, and the potential for developing and multiplying by 2 this number of wells in China. And we are also partner of Santos in Australia on the upstream part of Gladstone, which is gas coming from coal bin methane. So in fact, we are already a global actor on unconventional. We always think that the unconventional is associated with the shale revolution in the States, and we know that some factors created this revolution in the States. But in fact, we know now that this is a global business and we can have activity. So the potential is everywhere. We have conventional resources to develop unconventional.
Good. I'm going to bring Jim and Tricia back into the debate, but I want to open the floor up to questions. So anybody have any questions in this space? Well, a lot of questions, I thought. So if we can get the microphones. If you can stand up, it'll make life much easier. Any questions from this side of the floor? We'll let the first question come in. Hold on just a second. I have a question for Tricia and Jim. The U.S. crossed 10.6 million barrels a day in the last month. It's pretty extraordinary, right, in itself. So that puts it up in the ranks of Saudi Arabia, Russia in terms of its production, which is extraordinary. And everybody wants to know, how sustainable is it? How much more can we find? The technology revolution, does it keep on going? Or as some were projecting, the plateau comes at 2025, 2030, and starts to tail off? What's your view?
I think from a technological standpoint, we're definitely in the early innings. So 10.3 million barrels per day has been we've ratcheted that up, and that is a pretty good number. And I think, you know, most people were not forecasting the U.S. to exit at 10 million barrels per day at the end of 2017, and we did. So I think in terms of a technological standpoint, when you think about how operators are working in the Permian and the early stages that they're in pad development and how close they're spacing their wells and how they're completing them, it's very much in the beginning. So I think the opportunity to expand upon that is quite ripe.
Quite ripe. People willing to finance it, or these are all self-financing now, James?
The biggest shift that's happened since the downturn is that the U.S. companies, in particular the public companies that are focused on the shale, as Tricia said, are being forced by public investors to be self-financing so that they run their business models as opposed to borrowing money or going to investors for capital, that they can convince investors that they have a sustainable business model that can generate free cash flow.
Good. From the Halliburton perspective?
Yeah, I think the technology continuum has just begun. I think what's happened in the shale is just a early data point as to what's possible. I think innovation, there's plenty of room for innovation. I think in big data analytics, digitization, reservoir characterization, and we've just begun on the drilling curve. Automation technologies and integration of downhole tools with surface drilling components of rigs is just beginning. I think the best is yet to come, and I think what bodes well for places like Bahrain is they're going to be able to take advantage of those things as they continue to develop themselves, and that will help commercialize resources that have not been economic in the past. So I'd say stay tuned.
Okay, perfect. You don't think this point I brought up about stranded assets is a real threat to Bahrain or any other producers?
No, I think the technology story in the United States is a classic case. The cost per barrel has been driven down in time. The lower the costs, the more economic they are. I think the cost per barrel has been driven down not only through better wells, but also through lower costs. And so I think that will bode well for stranded resources or currently uneconomic resources.
Okay, perfect. The question from the floor, just identify yourself, and if you don't mind, direct the question to our panel.
Rashid Tahir from U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The panel have discussed about the opportunities and the challenges and the concerns about this oil. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things that we heard. These challenges and these concerns and these opportunities are nothing but good. I'm least worried and least concerned about all of this attention that has brought. If I was an investor, I will bring 110% of my investment. I will borrow 10% more and bring it to Bahrain. This is the time for all of us, and I hope all my colleagues who can hear this, just come in. Bahrain now has the wild card, and congratulations.
That wasn't a question, but a statement. That's a pretty good endorsement. I think it's a good time to bring the minister back in, and we can wrap up the session. When you sit with His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and you look over the field estimates and the cost of development and the ability to open up the field, I see Khalid Rumaiti in the front row here, and this discussion about how open we want to be with this resource. What is the debate in Bahrain of how much of a game changer this will be, Minister? Because you have to manage expectations at the same time, and I'm sure it's a steep learning curve with all this international attention. Please.
Well, I think most of this is really made possible by the drive of His Royal Highness. I mean, he leads a committee in cabinet that's responsible for natural resources, and it was his drive that really brought us here. Now, we're very responsible, so we're not throwing big numbers in terms of production. We're telling you what the facts are. There is time to be spent. We're very optimistic, but we're not making projections into what the productions are going to be. So we remain very responsible, but at the same time, we know that this is a real resource. I mean, I thank Mr. Tahir. He's a bit biased for saying what he said, but it's a real resource. But nevertheless, there are challenges, as always. We've been working very quietly in this sector. There's a lot happening, not just in the upstream, but you've got the Babco expansion happening. That's going to be one of the best configured refineries in the region. We also have gas plants under construction. We have a new pipeline with Saudi Arabia, an LNG terminal. All of that has been done very quietly, and I think we've hit the markets at the right time, and we've diversified our sourcing of capital. The fund as well is in addition to all of that. So we remain excited. I think we do have a fiscal challenge, but the government is looking at all the reforms, and what we're doing is trying to increase oil revenues, which puts challenge on Khalid trying to diversify away from oil. So I'm in a race with him. But still, I think it's all good news. It's all good news.
Good. One final point, and if this is for you, Your Excellency. Are you thinking, as you talked about it briefly there, downstream quickly with this potential as well? I know this has been a push by Khalid Al-Faleh, His Excellency, in Saudi Arabia. Let's move downstream, get into petrochemicals. You talked about the investment into Babco, but how does this food chain, if you will, industrial chain fit together?
Well, with the refinery, we've actually designed an aromatics complex. So in petrochemicals, you have two routes. You have aromatics and olefins. So the aromatics is fully designed. We've been talking to the Kuwaitis and other GCC investors to start that once we're done with the Babco refinery. But with an unconventional play, the oil is light. So you have a lot of light ends. You will have ethane, and you potentially could go the olefins route. So an ethane cracker or a flexi cracker, they call it. So that's a potential. We've also reclaimed 2 kilometers of land that could be used for further downstream. And I think we're looking to really attract private investment money. Bahrain with an FTA with the US could really take advantage of downstream processing, so we have to be very selective on what the niche would be. But in petrochemicals, you have olefins and you have aromatics. We've designed the aromatics. I think with the tight oil play, there's a lot of light ends that could definitely give us the opportunity of going the olefins. So then you'd have the petrochemical foundations of basic petrochemicals. And then the downstream, I think with the private sector, you can easily define what niche Bahrain could take, given the volumes we have. So it's a lot of potential.
Perfect. I wanted to thank Your Excellency for pulling together such a really good roundtable. James, Jim, Tricia, and Christoph, thanks a lot. Nice round of applause to the panel, please. Thank you very much.